So 10 years ago, I found myself on exchange in Providence, Rhode Island. I arrived into deep winter, knowing no one. I took classes in philosophy, I hit the gym, I went to keg parties, I was a total cliche. I was both myself and another self, an American art school jock version of me. But while this short-term home was in an English-speaking culture, it was as if I spoke a different language. Americans mistook my irony and self-deprecation for suicidal tendencies. It dawned on me very quickly that without the familiar terrain of family, friends, or local history, I was no one to anybody. A person with no past and with an unwritten present. And this became an exceptionally liberating thing for me. Around this time, I began keeping a video journal, filming small fragments almost every day, turning the camera on myself. It was very emo, very Sophie Calle, but a formative time for the work that I make now. In a rudimentary way, this work, Makeshift, which I made while on exchange there, was a video that pieced together fragments of this journal, and it explored the idea of forming and performing oneself through the medium of video. Identity to be rewound, paused, and erased. I wore that Whole Foods bag in public spaces, hiding in plain sight. And in many ways, that's what I continue to do today. Self-portraiture, video, and performance are the main strategies I use to explore identity, territory, and nationalism. Orientalism and stereotyping have been ongoing preoccupations for me. As a second-generation Australian, I'm nevertheless forever bound by appearance to China, an unknown motherland I visited for the first time just last month. What used to once give me the shits, being judged on face value for what's skin deep, has become a useful and powerful tactic for me in my work. Through imperfect translations and amplifications of otherness or ethnicity, skin becomes a costume to magnify cultural displacement. Skin is a screen or surface that invites a plural or expanded understanding of exclusion or belonging. As the writer Shimon Basar says, it's important to displace oneself, to feel ignorant, out of your depth, and vulnerable. Feeling uncomfortable is good. It's something everyone should practice. You need to lose your bearings in order to find yourself. In this spirit of discomfort, I look to create the tension between place and performance in my work. What are the visual or sonic clues that make us read a landscape or an environment, and what makes us perceive that someone does or doesn't belong? How can we exploit these signs and tropes? How can we represent more fluid and mongrel identities? I live in Brunswick, and in 2006 to 2007, I found myself commuting almost weekly up the Hume to Shepparton for work. I'd pass new suburbs like Craigieburn and Caroline Springs, houses on the hinterlands. I came to think a lot about the concept of home and the Australian dream, the lure of the quarter-acre block and the notion of territory, the great indoors, and home ownership, intrinsic parts of the Australian psyche. You can call me a total urbanite snob and you'd be right, but I started to think of these places as purgatory, a purgatory that was nonetheless replacing the bush as the most widespread contemporary Australian landscape. I often look to other texts to give me material, films, songs, books, and the work of other artists. When I'm working on something, I'm like a magpie. I'm always looking around for words and images to steal and reappropriate. Film's something I return to again and again because its images and sounds are so embedded in our collective psyche. Even though Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock is based on Joan Lindsay's fictional book, it's hardwired into our imagination. The beautiful waspish blonde on the cusp of womanhood being enveloped by untamed nature. It's nothing more than a colonial ghost story, but it's so etched into our memory that it might as well be real. Anyway, I started to wonder where Miranda had disappeared to. If she was still lost and had ended up somehow in purgatory or an in-between space, it would no longer be in the now park-rangered and walking tracked wilds of the Australian bush, but in the cookie-cutter sprawl and developments of suburban Australia. So here is Asian Miranda in Caroline Springs, which is 25k west of Melbourne. Yeah, it was an interesting shoot because I don't think Lend-Lease knew what I was doing, but they somehow allowed me to kind of have free reign. So this is Miranda appearing in Caroline Springs. And I might play just a little excerpt from the video. So this work, Australian Landscapes, was a body of work I made for an exhibition in 2009, and it comprised these photos and also video as well. So I might play a bit of that for you now. I want to shout out to the artist Zheng Guangzhi, and you can see some of his work here. This is his series East Meets West. He passed away in 1990, so he had a very short but very prolific career. And I want to show this particular series because it's been quite a formative one for me in my practice. You'll kind of see as the works go on, I guess, the kind of legacy of what he was looking at. But I wanted to talk about him because the foundation story for this series was that Zheng Guangzhi was living in New York City. He was from Hong Kong, and he was a struggling artist. He was hanging out with Andy Warhol and that whole crew, but he had no money. And his parents came to visit him from Hong Kong, and they took him out to a fancy meal, and he had no sort of formal attire. All he had was this mouse suit that he put on to go to the dinner. So they went to the dinner, and the parents paid for everything, and it turns out that because of the suit, he got mistaken for a Chinese diplomat, like a dignitary from the mainland, and he loved this. It became just such a kind of wonderful punk tactic that he could use, and so he travelled around throughout the States and Europe, taking pictures of himself in front of monuments with his very formal Mao suit. And the legend has it that his name tag, you can kind of see it a little bit there, actually read "Slut for Art." So it was kind of a dead giveaway that he wasn't actually a diplomat, but he was actually just a punk artist taking the Occident for a ride. So no one looked close enough to sort of see this, so he got away with murder. And so to me, this series represents his clever exploitation of racial stereotypes and assumptions of the other. He called himself an ambiguous ambassador, so you'll see that I kind of have taken that mantle a little bit as well. So someone who's a citizen of the world, but also foreign in every context as well. So to me, there's a great power and potential in this kind of ambivalence. And I try and explore this idea of foreignness in my own work as well. So no strangers to posing in front of monuments. Here are my parents in front of Ron Robertson Swan's The Vault. It's a sculpture probably many of you are familiar with. And here they are in front of its original location in City Square in 1980. Ever since I first came across this image in a family album some years ago, I knew I was going to do something with it. It was just too good to pass up. But at the time of taking the picture, it would have just been a casual snapshot because they love posing in front of things. So we've got plenty of these photos kicking around. But with the passage of time and the checkered history of the vault sculpture itself, and also the sort of shifting relationship between Australia and China as well, this image sort of started to, kind of talk about many things for me, and it kind of synthesised the personal and the political as well. And it was the catalyst for the Yellow Peril body of work, which I'll talk a bit about now. Here is the vault. So after public outcry and people dubbing it the Yellow Peril and hating the sculpture, it was moved to Batman Park, so you can see it going into disrepair. It was graffitied, it was shelter for homeless people. It was basically unloved by the city. And I found that very potent. It was a very interesting motif to work with because I felt like even though this sculpture has nothing to do with border panic or xenophobia, it's got such a emotive moniker, and it has sort of had this history as a sort of cultural pariah, but now it's actually an icon of Melbourne. So you can actually see it, in some of the super tram stops in the city. You can see Yellow Peril everywhere in our architecture. It's just become such a celebrated icon of Melbourne. So I'm interested that something within, quite a short 2 or 3 decades of history can have such an evolution. Here are some installation shots from the Yellow Peril exhibition, which was on at Bus Projects last year. You can see the image of my folks has been printed onto gold emergency blanket. Gold has sort of become quite an important, theme and motif for me, so it carries through. This is the vault in miniature, you can see on the left, and this is the Welcome Stranger nugget, sort of rendered life-size. So gold's known as the democratic mineral, and the Herald Sun still blasts, sort of eureka headlines about lucky prospectors striking gold quite regularly because it still happens a lot. But one would argue that in today's age of super pits and minor exploitation in developing nations, that actually this idea of the democratic mineral is kind of quite an ironic one. This is my miner's right, which I bought online a few years ago at the kind of research phase of this project. But actually the foundation story of Australian democracy, it's entwined with mining and I guess arguably with that of racism. So I wouldn't have been able to have a miner's right if I was a Chinese gold digger back in the day. The Eureka Rebellion led to the miner's right in sort of 1855 era, but this was only for full white male suffrage. So it was kind of a democracy that was built on exclusion, I would argue. And if Australian democracy is inherently unequal or uneven, what then do its symbols mean? For example, the Eureka flag. So you can see a really awesome tattoo on the left there. these kind of symbols, flags are such loaded things, and I guess I thought about this a lot because I designed a flag. I was invited to design one. I was thinking about how can you do, it's such a loaded thing in itself. So the Eureka, on the one hand, you would say that it represents civil disobedience, autonomy, agency, but on the other hand, it's been adopted by nationalists and neo-Nazis. So I guess, there are so many ways we could kind of look at these different symbols, but just taking one, it's interesting to see that flip and the idea that by asserting an identity, when we're talking about ideas of nationalism and territory, largely we are keeping a tribe in and we're excluding others, keeping others out. So in 1855, 1 year after the Eureka Rebellion, the Chinese Immigration Act was introduced in Victoria, and that restricted Chinese entry into the Victorian colony. And then in 1901, when Australia was federated, one of the first policies was the White Australia policy. So mining, gold, immigration, and this idea of yellow peril, all these things coalesced in this body of work. And I'll play an excerpt from the video. It's an 18-minute work, and it was on show with the other works that you saw just before. So I'll just end by talking about a couple of works in development for next year and following year, which feature this same ambassador character. The first is the Australian Ugliness, and it definitely riffs on this classic tome about the Australian identity by the architect Robin Boyd, 1960 book, which actually was out of print for, I think, maybe 30 years, which is quite interesting in itself. To Boyd, the idea of the Australian ugliness was an aesthetic and ethical gap in the Australian psyche. He sort of called this love of surface and veneer featureism, the kind of a lazy satisfaction with things that are mediocre or cosmetic. Boyd wrote his book 50 years ago, and it comes from, quite a modernist and somewhat dated vision. But at the same time, a lot of what he's talking about and exploring is so relevant, and I think will always be relevant. And in my project, I'm hoping to look at the idea of sort of simultaneous alienation and belonging that comes with ideas of national identity and national architecture. I'm interested in thinking about the idea that Australia is as much about what is absent, what's left out of the frame, and what's not talked about as what is shown. Because when you think about Australia and you look at it through the lens of, I guess, our most confident culture makers. So in design we have Mark Newson, and I love this original quote of his. And for example, Mark Newson, who's made a design for the Beretta shotgun. You can't get much more macho than that. The work of Sean Gladwell, the architecture of ARM, the architecture of Lions. I mean, these are iconic, these are sort of icons of Melbourne and of Australia, I would argue. And in film we have, Baz Luhrmann and George Miller. If you look at Australia just through these things that we project or these images that we export and also that we reflect upon ourselves as well, you'd say that Australia is loud, puffy-chested, iconic, colourful. It's also overwhelmingly white, male and macho. And I wonder where the rest of us fit into that. So in my work, it's still very formative and speculative, but hopefully I get to make it. I want to throw open these tropes of Australia. I want to find something that's a bit more discordant and plural and fluid. And so the idea is that my ambassador character will roam through Australian architecture and through the streets of the cities, acting as client, tourist, observer to the built environment, and we'll see what happens when I make that. The last work I'll talk about is one that will happen for Asia Topa, which is a performing arts and contemporary art triennial starting next year in Melbourne. And I'm making a work called The People's Currency. So it's more of a China-related project, but for me, I guess I see China as the workshop of the world, so I sort of feel like we're all kind of involved or implicated in what's happening over there. So for my project, I'm looking to create a sort of factory space, a closed sort of special economic zone. So I'll be printing currency as the ambassador, and the general public will come and work in my factory, so I hope you all come and work in my factory. So here's some just research material. There's nothing much of mine that I can show you, but I've been looking a lot at, the aesthetics of labour and also, the human impact of globalisation as well. So when I was over in China, I was thinking a lot about, how things are made and, these devices that we use, what's the actual kind of embodied or human experience of how these things are made. So, all of these things are kind of coming into the work. So thinking about the iPhone as this emblem of globalization, and thinking a lot about Foxconn, which is the kind of maker of iPhones. What is the kind of human cost of all of these things? So my ambassador character this time, when she appears, will be a kind of, I guess some sort of weird triangulation of Henry Ford, Terry Guo, who's the CEO of Foxconn, and this guy who I guess everyone would know. And and that will be me next year. So come and work in my factory. Thanks very much, everyone.